casualties.
The enemy has killed another infantry squad.
The Company of Heroes titles are amazing. They're fun real-time strategy games that focus mostly on microing units and making use of combined arms while having an amazing presentation, from the voice lines to the music to the effects. Alongside Dawn of War, it contends for the best Relic franchise. However, while Company of Heroes 2 doesn't have Dawn of War 3 levels of retardation, it still stumbled a lot. If I had made this video in 2013 when it launched, it would have been a gigantic rant about all that's wrong with it. But right now the game is in a pretty good spot. There have been plenty of improvements that fixed most of its problems. Not everything's fixed, however. There's plenty of reasons why someone could prefer the original title. So in this video I'll go through both games and analyze them in depth, taking a look at the core differences in both the single player and the multiplayer. Let's begin.
Enemy unit.
Both Company of Heroes are real-time strategy games taking place in the Second World War. They have a lot in common. Both have base building as a way to tech up, you can only get resources through map control, and they have a commander system. The resources are always the same: manpower for almost everything, munitions for upgrades and abilities, and fuel for vehicles and teching up. Points on the map will give you a trickle of one of these resources. There's ways to increase the production of a single sector, but for most games the back and forth of the front lines will determine what units you'll be able to afford. In true Relic fashion, the presentation is the strongest point. Graphics are obviously better in the sequel, but all factions in both games have amazing music tracks and voice acting. Units comment on who they're fighting, how far they're moving, what they have killed, the weather and more. And will also get mad if you keep clicking them, which makes for good entertainment.
Airborne! Time to shit-kick player one! Airborne!
Yeah, by himself.
Airborne ready. What the fuck do you want?
Excellent.
There's also some bad stuff that they share. First of all, in both games, the camera is way too zoomed in. This was a problem in Dawn of War 1 as well, but you can't play Company of Heroes online with camera mods. It's not Soulstorm levels of crippling, the game actually plays fine, but it would play better if you could zoom back more. A lot of units can shoot targets a whole screen away, and it makes the tactical map almost a necessity. With it in Company of Heroes 1, you can only give attack move commands, but in Company of Heroes 2, you can give pretty much any order with a noticeable exception of reinforcing squads. Dawn of War 2 had an auto-reinforce button that would be of considerable help for the player, but they decided it wasn't a good idea to have that in Company of Heroes. Anyway, the tactical map is only accessible by pressing 0 on the numpad, which is possibly the least convenient key on the keyboard. Neither title allows you to rebind hotkeys, which was unacceptable in 2006, but even more so in 2013. Company of Heroes 2 has the option to either have legacy or grid hotkeys, which is at least a bit of choice, but I shouldn't have to use an auto hotkey script to have a borderline essential feature mapped to a decent button. I also wish the series did garrison fighting better. It's a bit silly to have people just shoot at walls. Both games have a rather similar flow. You build, get your units out, cap, battle with the enemy, suppress, flank, retreat, reinforce squads, toss nades, wipe enemy squads, and you tech up. Light vehicles come out, tanks come out, heavy tanks come out, plenty of artillery and air support is called, you capture and hold victory points, and eventually you win. The main differences, aside from the factions of course, are 1. The capture area. This allows weapon crews to capture and do work at the same time. On one end, capping was more deliberate in Company of Heroes 1, but on the other, units can prepare an area for later fights while still capping. 2. Quality of life. Vaulting, reversing, prioritizing vehicles, face directions in buildings for machine guns, holding fire and so on. These are all very useful commands that makes going back to Company of Heroes 1 a challenge. Also nice is the option of spectating games directly from the main menu. 3. True sight. In the sequel, units won't reveal part of the map they can't see. This makes a recon unit less useful, but also allows for ambushes and stop cheese like having jeeps hugging a wall for vision. It's a great change change, particularly it makes smoke way better, but on the downside it can be a bit buggy with tanks. 4. Lethality. In the first game, infantry is way more lethal, builder units aren't garbage and vehicle MGs would tear through infantry, but on the other hand tanks are way more tanky. Not only it's easier for shells to bounce, but tanks also have plenty of HP, while Panzerfausts and equivalent don't always damage their engine. Also worth pointing out is that neither game has side armor modded, it's either the front or the rear.
That was a direct hit, but it did little damage because of the Panzer's heavy armor. You need to flank the enemy tank and attack its rear armor, which is weaker.
Another way tanks are harder to kill is criticals. For some reason, someone decided that when a tank is very low on health, it should receive criticals instead of dying. It's a bit frustrating. Not as frustrating as the snipers in the first game, good thing they got nerfed in the sequel. 5. Suppression. Company of Heroes 1 has a very good suppression model where tank machine guns, automatic weapons and even rifles would eventually suppress enemies. In the sequel, only heavy machine guns and some abilities have this effect, which makes blobbing easier to do. That's when you just spam a lot of infantry and move them around, picking off lone squads and support weapons. Not that it's a particularly carcinogenic strategy, it's actually both useful and counterable, but it's just weird that machine guns don't suppress unless they're on a tripod or a cart. Also, in the first game, units would get down when shelled by artillery, which means that indirect fire is a good way to actually slow and separate enemy blobs, although it makes microing when under fire a bit annoying. 6. Damage types. In Company of Heroes 1, light vehicles were powerless against light tanks. Both games still have damage types for infantry, but at least in the sequel, a Puma isn't inexplicably incapable of damaging Stuarts. There's a lot more comparatively minor differences, and a major one which is hands down the worst. Number 7. The Commander System. In Company of Heroes 1, each faction had 3 commanders to choose from. For the Americans, this represented the titular companies, for the other factions not so much. With a couple of exceptions, you'd choose a doctrine later in the game, depending on how it was going. If you're losing ground as Brits, you go engineers and call in a Churchill. If you needed infantry, you'd go commando and call glider-borne troops. And if you're just holding ground, you'd go artillery. Each commander also had 2 different paths you could spend command points on, which you get by killing units. For example, in the Panzer Elite's Tank Hunter doctrine, you could go for Hetzers, which are the closest thing that faction has to a medium tank, or rush the Jagd Panther. There was thought put into the decision of what commander to pick. Sure, not all of them are equal. For example, Scorched Earth for the Panzer Elite allows you some early game shenanigans, but it quickly loses relevance in the mid game, so I don't see it chosen often. But anyway, how does this work in the sequel? First of all, there's no paths or choice once you've selected a commander. Units become available at X amount of CPs and that's it. Some doctrinal units are available at 0 CPs, which means that those doctrines are most useful if picked right away, further diminishing the decision making in picking a commander. There's still 3 commanders to choose from in each game, but differently from the first Company of Heroes, you can equip different combinations of them in between games. There's plenty of commanders to pick, some are similar to each other, some offer unique units that are very strong. You can drop them after a game, or you can buy them from the in-game shop. Or from Steam? Sneaky tactic hiding them from the DLC tab. Each victory gives you 1/90th of a commander, and that's if you don't drop camos or bulletins. Bulletins are a completely out of place and retarded concept. They are small equipable bonuses that do stuff like making your basic infantry squad reload 5% faster. That cuts 1 entire millisecond from the reload animation. Most of them are worthless and probably made to dilute the drop pool. Some are kind of neat but never too impactful. Anyways, on the store there's bundles that go up to €150. Is this gameplay to win? Well, to answer that, we need to bring up the calcometer! The cacometer is the most scientific way to determine whether or not a game is worth playing depending on how much you're willing to spend. Ideally, paid games shouldn't even be on the cacometer, but alas, we do not live in a perfect world. So where does Company of Heroes 2 sit? Well, some of these commanders do seem to give you extremely powerful units. The American Pershing, for example, is their only heavy tank and it's only available from the heavy cavalry doctrine. For the longest time, this commander was also the only one to have Rangers, a very strong squad of heavy infantry. Also, consider how long it would take a new player to stop dropping bulletins and start dropping in-game currency. There's an argument to be made that the grind is indeed unreasonable. So does it go in the ultra cac tier? No. You can and will drop plenty of commanders, and Relic doesn't make packs of OP commanders just to sell them anymore. The newest commanders they added were free for everyone, like this handsome fellow. While some are better for some maps than others, no commander gives you a complete advantage over your enemy. So for me it goes in the lightly cac tier, but I'd understand if someone would be completely turned off by all these DLCs. Real-time strategy games are a genre that thrives on fairness. They're half micro and half strategy. And half cheese. There's very few RTSs that have attempted to have a multiplayer affecting progression system, and of course let's not forget that this game isn't free. If it were, it would be easier to justify this. I mean, some people got it for free, but that doesn't count. Personally, I can still enjoy this game, but maybe I wouldn't if I were playing with a fresh account. It's still fair enough. It's frustrating to face commanders you don't have, but I also can't forget that I literally dropped all USF commanders back in the day. Except heavy cavalry. You could just use the cheat command mods to farm a victory every 5 minutes. In my opinion, the grind for new commanders would be just fine if bulletins and camos weren't a droppable thing. Of course, all of this won't matter if you never play online, so let's analyze the single player before we come back to the multiplayer later, starting with Company of Heroes 1. The vanilla campaign is long enough and also kind of works as a tutorial, which is good because the actual tutorial is...
In Company of Heroes, using abilities is always done with the left mouse button.
It has a particular emphasis on teaching you what each commander is for and what their units do. Not all missions are great, but most are enjoyable and the set pieces are fun. Oh no, it's Ghost Recon all over again. There's also named characters that talk to each other, give orders or die, but nothing too intrusive. I'll get to you, Abramovich. For now, let's talk factions. Americans are a fun one. Their buildings are neatly divided in infantry, support weapons, light vehicles and tanks. Their standout feature is the supply dump building that has upgrades to lower the upkeep of units. When it comes to doctrines, Airborne gives you paratroopers and air support, the Armor Company gives you Pershings and Calliopes, and the Infantry one gives you Rangers and Artillery. Overall, they're a simple and effective faction. They might be my favorite. There's no introductory campaign for the Wehrmacht, so the learning curve is a bit steeper for them. Their buildings make different types of units, which makes it easier to skip one and rush the next. That's because they're locked behind battle phases rather than requiring previous ones. I'm not as good as them as I am with the Americans, but they have plenty of ridiculously powerful units. The Nightcross holders, for example, are just insane. Their doctrines go as follows. Defensive Doctrine gives you more HP on defensive structures, machine guns in the base, and awareness around your captured sectors. Blitzkrieg gives you plenty of new units and abilities to make them stronger. The Terror Doctrine is the most meme one. There's V2 rockets, King Tigers, AoE laxatives, and early on, fanaticism that buffs squads which suffered casualties. It pairs well with Nightcross holders. Their most unique feature is that they can buy veterancy from a building, which gives them an easier time when replacing losses in the late game. Both the Americans and the Wehrmacht can secure territory points with observation posts. This prevents capture until destroyed and increase the resource income of a sector. With the first expansion came 2 new factions and a campaign for each of them. The first one is Operation Market Garden, where we play as the Panzer Elite. They have the best campaign in my opinion. It follows 2 brothers fighting around Belgium as paratroopers and glider-borne units desperately try to capture an access into Germany. The other takes place in Normandy, where Major Blackmore leads a variety of British and Dominion troops to take and hold the city of Caen.
2 cuts.
2 guts.
Baldy didn't even lose his pipe.
While the Americans and the Wehrmacht are kind of similar to each other, the Panzer Elite and the Brits are designed based on opposite principles. The Panzer Elite is born to compete and sometimes retreat. They're focused on speed and cheap light vehicles while having an interesting tech structure. The first building gives you support vehicles, like a scout car that can capture and secure territory, or the Funkwagen half track. This hilarious vehicle sucks off 50% of the income from an enemy territory, becomes invisible and spawns Goliaths. It's such a fun unit when you can use it well. The other units are all either specialized or glass cannons, which makes them very effective but also very vulnerable. They start with an unarmed Kettenkrad that gets different abilities depending on the selected doctrine, and their basic infantry unit, the Panzer Grenadiers, have a multitude of unlockable upgrades which makes them very versatile. Their doctrines are Scorched Earth, which focuses on traps and later on artillery, Luftwaffe, which gives you Fallschirmjägers and versatile defenses, or Tank Hunter Tactics that gives you plenty of anti-tank potential. Veterancy is also unique in the way that you can either choose defensive or offensive upgrades in each level to further specialize your troops, although it's not specified what they actually do. In general, Company Virus 1 is less transparent than the sequel. The Brits, on the other hand, are designed around emplacements. Their basic infantry squad normally moves very slowly when in neutral or enemy territory, but they're very strong and can beat defenses like trenches and MG nests. In theory, their lack of early repairs, their slowness and their lack of normal weapon crews means that it's easy to deny them a lot of map control, but in practice they can just park their truck on the most useful contested point on the map and they'll never dislodge. They're very cheesy and very hard to fight once they're entrenched, which I guess it's the point, but there's not much you can do once they get in place. I described their doctrines before, so I won't repeat myself, but they're all very useful. Unique to them are officers. They are their only unit that can obtain veterancy and they give a bonus to nearby troops. They can maintain the chain of command to automatically stay near a unit, which makes me wonder why they didn't just have the option to merge them down of war style. Assist, the officers automatically maintain enough distance that they're realistically never going to die in a gunfight outside of snipers, mines or other cloaked units ambushing them. And that's the lieutenants. The captain buffs everyone in his sector, so you can just hide him in the backline and he'll still be useful. Also, the Stuart is bullshit. One more expansion was developed with 3 new campaigns but no more factions. Instead, it gave the players alternative units they can select in the menus to replace normal ones. Some of these are side grades, like the Schwimmwagen for the Panzer Elite is like a Kettenkrad with different doctrinal abilities. Others feel like straight upgrades, but I wouldn't be surprised if a good player showed me wrong. The worst one is definitely the hotkeys for the Panzer Elite. Would you want to trade a tank that's great against infantry and bad against vehicles for a tank that's useless against both? Me neither, it's a scam. You can give it rockets for 100 ammo, but it's not worth it. Another new bit of multiplayer content are operations. It's 3 different side modes that nobody plays. There's a MOBA one that's pathetic, a tank battle and a defense against waves of enemies. The new campaigns are pretty fun, however, if a bit too easy. Tiger Ace puts you in control of an overpowered tiger. You destroy a British column, the crew escapes without the tank, and you come back with 2 tigers. Then there's Causeway, where you control 2 overpowered paratrooper squads. You capture the causeway, defend the causeway, and finally counterattack the causeway. Lastly, there's the Falaise Pocket, which is a battle we already fought with the other side in the Normandy campaign. No overpowered unit this time, unless we're counting Flak 88s. You wake up everyone and then first stop recon elements from spotting allied tanks, then defend the city against an assault, then defend the river while retreating units evacuate the pocket. I'm not making them sound like much, but they're fun, it's all in the execution. They definitely lean too much on the easy side, especially the first 2, but they're still enjoyable. The last mission in the last campaign is also probably bugged. The enemy only attacked 1 river crossing and with meager forces. Either that or they hyped the mission way too much. much. It's neat that there's a lot of connections between the campaigns. This guy here in the Tigris campaign is this Panzer Elite officer and also the faction's announcer. He also says,
Wolfgang, we have done it, though it appears I have lost my cross.
which I guess fell into a wormhole and was found in Normandy by Blackmore. His gunner gets promoted and commands this tiger in the American campaign, which got duplicated in the cutscene for some reason.
Hey guys, wasn't this Schultz the one who killed the captain?
Yeah. Didn't he almost kill you too, Lieutenant?
Shut the fuck up, Cunningham.
Shutting up, sir.
I think this would be a good time to mention bugs. Some are really funny, like this treacherous Nebelwerfer taking up arms against me, deposing models, skipping dialogues,
You've pulled the assemble your troops and recce the area.
endlessly out of control vehicles,
Just get going! Jesus! Come on!
Our
go!
forces are taking
Go
casualties.
faster! Let's go! Let's go!
Taking fire. Infantry reserves en route. Reinforcement proceeding. Enemy unit down.
and most importantly, sometimes unit selection just won't work and you won't be able to select, deselect or properly move your units. It's annoying but very rare.
Driver, get us over there! Dancing to the area now. There's mortal contact! Moving out! Come
Comrades, report the enemy has destroyed a vehicle.
Let's move on to the sequel. Company Virus 2's campaign isn't great. There was actually a minor controversy about the story when the game launched.
Justin Bieber.
It follows a main character called
Lev Abramovich Zakovich.
That's the worst name I ever heard.
comrade!
He's an ex-officer imprisoned in a gulag as his ex-superior is going over his journal. This is the main framing device in the campaign and it's garbage. They were trying to have the main character conflicted about the Soviets' brutish and uncaring style of leadership, but it fails on two levels. First of all, your superior is cartoonishly evil.
Our forces are still in the fields!
We cannot let the Germans advance. Torch the fields now! Good job, comrade.
It isn't a bad concept, but the problem is in the execution.
Where have you been, Private?
Preventing the capture of a valiant Soviet officer, Comrade Major.
Like, come on. Most of the campaign goes for this depressing tone, which is fine, but just doesn't fit Company Virus.
My brother, they are the enemy. Don't forget that.
Are you so sure about that? They look like soldiers to me.
The second level in which the framing device fails is that the game just forgets about it. At some point we're in a guy's flashback and Abramovich is telling the story of this flashback.
2 cats.
2 guns.
Then for some reason he becomes a journalist and gets involved in behind enemy lines levels he should have no business being in. Finally he gropes his commander tits and this happens.
Report to Colonel Saitov and the 8 Guards.
You're assigning me to a penal battalion?
Yeah, Soviet HR was kind of brutal.
This is a death sentence.
Except in this game, penal troops are elite infantry and they have a better chance of surviving battles than conscripts. You'd think that out of everyone, the Dawn of War people would have done something interesting with penal battalions. Not that it matters for the story anyway, Abramovich is never a gameplay element.
I will not wait for you, journalist. If you endanger us, I'll kill you myself.
Good thing he isn't in the level then. In fact, chronologically this is the last time we see our main character before the gulag. On that matter, the missions are bad as well. Most of them are either a boring defense, a boring town assault where you have all the time you want to complete objectives and then the game decides it's bunch of shit time, or occasionally awfully scripted low unit sequences. And I don't mean too linear, I mean that the AI is coded to act like retards. There's a couple of nice levels that, perhaps coincidentally, are completely disconnected from the framing device. There's one where you're ambushed by...
God damn it! That tank carcass!
by a tiger. So you fight it a bit around some houses, which is a perfect use of true sight, and then it runs away. You chase and finish it, recruit and repair it, and slowly drive it back to the spawn. Then there's a town assault where 2 Soviet officers banter back and forth and are racing each other in taking this fortress.
We want the honor of capturing Poznan. We can take this city. Why don't you rest up for Berlin? I don't think so, Colonel General. We will not be content to just sit I can provide support to you here.
It's good fun to hear higher-ups bicker with each other and compete for prestige with blatant uninterest in their troops' well-being. It's a good way to play on the Soviet doctrine without dragging the tone of the game down.
There, my Polish friend. All that you bargained for and more besides. The Red Army knows how to take care of its friends.
What in the name of God have you done, Pasharsky?
2 cats.
2 guts.
By the way, one of these officers is the player, but not Abramovich. See what I mean? Why did they bother with this? In every mission you have the option to call on free infantry squads. This works as a way to simulate a human wave strategy of sort, and when calling them in, you activate Order 227. While this order is active, your retreating infantry will be executed. This is a good way to teach players how to soft retreat, except it doesn't work. Why? The theme of quantity versus quality is also thrown out of the window for most levels because of an overuse of Austruppen. There are 6-man squad which are supposed to be fodder while either support weapons or proper infantry deals damage, but the campaign uses them every chance it gets, so you often outgun enemies with your free conscripts. Anyway, at the end of the story, your superior shoots the executioner, suicides, and Abramovich roams the Siberian wastelands to presumably die of exposure. Maybe Prohor found him? Never mind, gulags are in walking distance of cities. Right, I forgot. You could have done something interesting with this framing device. Maybe instead of forcing the player to set Soviet soldiers on fire, you could have these sacrifices as secondary objectives. Then at the end, punish the player with a bad ending if he chose the easy way too many times. But instead, we get this needless and incoherent storyline. The final nail in the coffin is that the campaign is lacking all quality of life improvements introduced after launch, and also the tactical map doesn't work. The single worst bug in this game is the camera pan bug. Basically, when you drag pan the map using the middle mouse button, sometimes it spazzes out, which is a problem of course. I tried different hardware and rebinding the button without hotkey and it still happens, although not regularly. I'm not sure if I'm alone in having this problem, but it is extremely annoying and makes the tactical map even more essential. And one last thing I want to complain about is that off-map support is always red on the minimap regardless of who uses it. There's no reason why it shouldn't be, say, yellow for your team and red for the enemies. Another part of the single player content is the Theaters of War, aka extremely overpriced mission packs. 10 euros, 3 scenarios and 3 skirmishes. Look at this, the enemy doesn't even attack move. Hey, there's war crimes at least. Imagine the audacity to actually charge money for these. Maybe Tiger Ace doesn't suck, but I'll never know. There's a free one that's set in 1941. Here the balance is all over the place because most units aren't available.
Hey, funziona!
Perfect if you want to play slightly different skirmishes or slightly different wave defenses or even slightly different snow levels. Right, the snow. I forgot about the snow because most people did too by now. It was one of the most marketed aspects of the game, snow tech. Soldiers freeze to death, blizzards prevent air support and snow slows down units. The best part was sinking tanks that were standing on ice. This used to be a thing in multiplayer as well. Blizzards would occasionally come and you just had to wait it out mostly. It wasn't terribly fun and eventually the balanced team decided to remove cold tech entirely from ranked games. I'm not nostalgic for it, but in retrospect it's funny to see the one thing that made the settings stand out being thrown in the trash bin.
A man has fallen into the river in Lego City.
While we are discussing the vanilla game, let's talk vanilla factions, starting with the Ostheers. They have a decent amount of units deploying from the HQ, which makes skipping tiers easy, especially with some doctrinal help. Ostruppen openings are my favorite because of all the map control and because they are my spirit animal.
You can count on Ostruppen. No, really, you can. You can.
Scheiße, what is that stink?
Fuck!
It smells more foul than a human. What the hell? We don't have much time!
What now?
Get into half track! Move!
Confirmed.
Run! Run, damn it!
One day, German. One day.
The Grenadiers, however, are great. They have rifle grenades with good range and can get an MG42 for long-range dominance. The Panzer Grenadiers are amazing at short range and get a bonus when fighting next to vehicles. They also have battle phases and thus stack very similarly from the Wehrmacht in the first game. The doctrinal choices for all factions are too many to mention. Howitzers, heavy tanks, specialized infantry, officers, air support, wastes of ammo, there's plenty of choices.
Ready for deployment.
Soviets next. The idea is that every infantry squad is bigger than their German counterparts. Conscripts are your basic infantry unit and they're somewhat weak on their own. They have Molotov cocktails, which are a great area denial, and can sprint, which makes them good for flanking and catching tanks. I wonder why conscripts of all people are the only ones that know how to run, but it's cool to hear them shout. Their standout ability is the option of transferring models to other squads. This works very well with the 6-man weapon teams and the other infantry options. Pinals comes from tier 1 and they're a pretty solid squad with an anti-tank upgrade. Then there's shock troops and guards, which are doctrinal infantry for either close encounters or AT support. Very interesting is how their tank destroyers work. Su-76s are very good against infantry and weapon teams because of the barrage ability which their field gun share, while the Su-85 can spot for itself with a focused sight ability. Their tanks also have the option of ramming enemy vehicles. Both of these factions are very capable to base their whole strategy around weapon teams. Russian mobility, numbers and versatility, or the amazing suppression rate and fire arc of the German MGs means that both of them can just spam defenses and be a tumor. For me, support weapon spam is the most annoying strategy to go against, be it just plenty of machine guns or a full-blown strong point. The Brits can also do this, but we'll get to them. It's not really an overpowered strategy, it's map dependent, works better in team games, and there's plenty of counters if you recognize it early enough. But the problem is that it both counters normal infantry play and itself. The best way to beat MGs is indirect fire, and indirect fire is countered by indirect fire, so it's an arms race. This couldn't really happen in the first game because the 3-man weapon crews were too fragile. If you're struggling with it, my advice is to veto the narrow maps and play Soviets. Their 120mm mortars are unreasonably strong. Maybe this strategy will be nerfed in future patches, but it has been here since release more or less. Yeah, one of the biggest points in favor of Company Heroes 2 is that it's still being updated. There's a community-led balance team making decently frequent updates, which gives the game longevity. Of course, there's a couple of stumbles here and there, but overall, I'd say they're doing a good enough job.
None of us were ready for the Ardennes. As soon as the clouds rolled in, so did the Germans.
The first expansion is set in the Battle of the Bulge.
Then, we launched the counterattack.
Spoilers! It introduces a new German faction, the Oberkommando West, alongside the USF, the American forces. You can either buy each individual faction, both of them, or the campaign, which doesn't come bundled with anything. Thanks Sega. I actually finished it during a free weekend, but for this video I decided to buy it. Not from Steam though, this campaign is good, but it isn't 20 euros good. Basically, you take control of 3 companies with their own unique abilities, units and upgrade paths and fight over the campaign map. The companies lose strength when soldiers die and they gain experience by fighting. You can spend meta resources to reinforce or upgrade them. Each one has different strong points and even personalities.
We stopped the fucking... No, that ain't gonna fly with Battalion. Damn Krauts, dead in their tracks around Mars.
After each mission, the company commander, which is also the announcer, will have a debrief of some sort, be it a report, a letter or a conversation where we get to know them better. They also comment on low or high casualties.
Sure, I lost men in the trenches, but these kids are dropping like flies.
In general, it oozes with personality. Whenever you win a battle on the map, the enemy units will retreat and reinforce another sector unless you stop them. This makes it important important to cut off the enemy escape every time you can, which adds a good layer of risk because companies lose strength when in enemy territory. The strength system actually makes what would normally be brain-dead and boring defense missions into nail-biters, as losing men can be costly. The campaign is decently challenging at hard, which was refreshing after the vanilla campaign and the theaters of war.
Unit's been wrecked! We're all that's left! Come on, boys! We can still push through this!
There's either scripted missions with particular objectives or skirmishes with some decent enough modifiers. For example, you might only receive manpower every X minutes, or maybe only vehicle kills will contribute towards victory, or maybe there's abandoned vehicles which cost fuel to crew, and when you leave the vehicle to repair it, it becomes abandoned again because they didn't script the level properly. Yeah, there's a couple of annoying bugs. They mostly come from a later change to the faction tech structure, which messed with the campaign version of the USF. Ardennes Assault is also perfect to relieve some sweet day one balance. Furthermore, the campaign is missing some quality of life improvements. It isn't as bad as the vanilla campaign though. And the tactical map doesn't work here either. Why? The silliest thing in the campaign is the magical anti-tank homing artillery. It's an extremely silly concept and a very strong ability. Good thing it isn't in the multiplayer. I said silly, I meant fair and balanced. The absolute best part of the campaign is that there's a lot of replayability because you can choose between 4 different companies at the beginning of the game. This allows you to mix and match more than you think, and no single campaign will ever be the same. Just kidding, the 4th one is DLC for the DLC. Thanks, Sega. Completing the campaign also gives you bulletins that instead of being useless are almost useless, which makes them pretty good compared to the normal ones. They honestly struck gold with Ardennes Assault. It's a fun, engaging and replayable campaign. Too bad it's extremely overpriced and the DLC can go burn in hell. Anyway, let's talk factions, starting with the Americans. The USF have an awful looking base that's pre-built. They need to unlock each building by recruiting its affiliated officer. Officers aren't like the British ones in Company of Heroes 1, everyone except OKW has a normal veterancy system. At the end of the day, they're normal squads with some decent utility. The true uniqueness of the USF is vehicle crews. Vehicle crews can dismount from tanks and repair them, which keeps them operational for longer periods or allows them to capture sectors when in an emergency. The Sherman in particular is my favorite tank of the game. They get bonuses for being in a group, have smoke launchers and can toggle between HE and AP shells. This basically makes them able to switch between generalists or infantry support tanks. Sadly, they have no access to heavy tanks outside of one doctrine, which makes their late game kind of bad. The other faction is the Oberkommando West. As mentioned before, they have the only unique veterancy system in the game. Basically, they have 5 veterancy levels instead of 3. On paper, this means that they have a slightly better late game, but of course bonuses are balanced differently, so there's no inherent difference from the normal veterancy system. Anyway, they are an aggression-focused army with plenty of solid units. They have the most dangerous engineer in the game, for example, the Sturmpioneer, which couples very well with the Kubelwagen. They take up by recruiting these big half trucks and converting them into static buildings. They're nowhere near as survivable as the British trucks from the original game, and there's no better feeling in the game than destroying one of them early on. One heal troops, one repair vehicles, and the other has a gun. However, they can't build caches because of an eventually scrapped design decision, as attested by this outdated tutorial video.
Now, overall, the Oberkommando West don't get as many resources as the other armies because of Germany's worsening economic situation in 1944.
Side note, outdated promotional developer commentaries aren't tutorials. The first Company of Heroes has some decent ones for the DLC factions. Here, they didn't bother. other. Caches replace OPs from the first game, they're only placeable on normal points, and for every other faction they're both a way to spend some excess manpower and secure a cutoff. It's not a particularly important omission, but it's worth mentioning. Or you could just farm a commander that has a scout card that can secure sectors. It's not the same, it costs a decent amount of fuel, but whatever, it's close enough. Requires not. Too bad it's limited to just one commander. To make up for their lack of caches, they have the option to salvage wrecks for fuel. Yeah, go my troops, suck all the fuel from that AT gun. It's also a great way to get rid of an enemy weapon you don't want to crew. Last faction is the British forces. They came out without an Axis counterpart and without any single player content. Instead of starting with builders, they start with a rifle section. They're good in cover, bad in the open, and lack vehicle snares. As in Company of Heroes, their shtick is defensive emplacements. Not as durable as in the first game, but this time with the option to brace them to make them temporarily tankier. Their SimCity strategy is nowhere near as powerful as it was. Punishing players for a greedy emplacement is easy and will put you ahead manpower wise. Similarly to the USF, the Brits took up by unlocking pre-built structures. They only have 2 unlockable tiers, none of them skippable, but you can stay in tier 1 and spend fuel to unlock anti-vehicle scout cars or anti-infantry buffers emplacements. You then have to actually build them, of course. Tier 2 gives you tanks of various quality and the option to either unlock hammer or anvil tactics. This is a choice between OK Churchills, whose better doctrinal variants are available from commanders, or Comet tanks, which are actually good and not available anywhere else. They're an okay faction, a bit too straightforward and lacking options, but they're fun. Their sniper in particular is interesting. It uses an anti-tank rifle which works both against vehicles and infantry.
Why did nobody go and put a nice telescopic sight on an anti-tank rifle and use it for sniping? The answer is that absolutely happened. A boy's anti-tank rifle is repeatably accurate, very supremely accurate, more powerful, and the gigantic anti-tank rifle bullet will do 3 times as much damage, and video games are the actual real world.
Now let's go back to the multiplayer. Company of Heroes 1 doesn't have the numbers of the sequel. This means you have to make a lobby, specify it's for noobs, kick people with too many played games, and just wait for players. And that can be a long wait. It's the wargame experience basically. It doesn't help that a lot of the community likes wasting their time with annihilation matches played on awful choke pointy maps. I mean, I understand that defending a bridge and spamming artillery for 2 hours is certainly a spectacle, but it's extremely boring. It also skews matches towards the Axis, since they're generally better in the late game because of the heavy tanks, the super off maps, and the flat veterancy upgrade to all units. Annihilation on regular maps is okay, as long as the resource rate is set to standard, otherwise this happens. And I thought support weapon spam was bad. In Company of Heroes 2 there's enough players where auto-match works, so you don't have to police a lobby or settle for meme games. The matchmaking isn't perfect, but I like it better than a lobby system. One small thing to mention is the modding scene. Company of Heroes 1 has plenty of mods taking place in entirely different settings. Perhaps the most relevant to this video is the Eastern Front mod. Look at this guy, using a flag like you would a cross on a vampire. I won't go in detail for any of them, just know that they're there if you want to try another theater of war. In Company of Heroes 2, modders aren't allowed to add new models to the game. That means that there can't be any total conversion or setting change. Thankfully, all of the garbage maps from the first game are in the workshop. And finally, let me touch on the community. Of course, since all games are Axis versus Allies, the community is more divided than American politics. If you asked for advice on how to counter a unit, for example, half of the people will tell you it's completely overpowered and there's no chance of countering it until it gets patched, and the other half will tell you that the unit is obviously underperforming and you're a retard if you're having trouble with it. However, most of the people I played with were fine human beings. Most of them.
As it is, lady.
Damn, the Russians are here.
But again, there's no mute button, so if you were to take Sun Tzu's advice to talk shit to heart, the other guy could do nothing about it. Other than that, it's the usual RTS mixed bag, nothing special. So, that was both Company of Heroes. To recap, the first game is better for meme matches while the sequel has more players, which makes playing it less of a chore. The graphics in the first game are obviously more dated, but still good looking. Neither game have good skirmish AI. The second game has garbage single player except for one expensive DLC and in general is monetized pretty aggressively. Most people will be turned off by the sheer amount of stuff you can spend money on in Company of Heroes 2, but if you can look past that, it's a pretty fun game kept fresh by balanced patches. Both games are entirely carried by the presentation. The sequel might be better in that regard, mostly because the units scream less, so it doesn't sound like Also, Company of Heroes 2 has Osttruppen. That's worth something. Jokes aside, there's plenty of reasons to prefer either game. Maybe you like the more lethal engagements of the first one, or maybe you hate the monetization of the sequel. Maybe you can't stand lobbies, or maybe you actually enjoy the variety of having 57 commanders for each faction. I prefer the sequel just because I can pick it up and play without having to set up a game, but if Company of Heroes 1 had enough people for Automatch to work, I'd play it more often. For me, the convenience of not having to wait 10 minutes for a proper game outweighs the frustrating moments, the stack units and the farming for commanders. Especially when I consider the quality of life improvements, not having a go backwards command on tanks gives me aneurysms. The bottom line is that they both have good and bad sides, but the faults in the first game come from its age, mostly, and the ones in the second game are there because of an effort to sell DLCs, mostly. It's a real pity, but as it is right now, after years of improvements, it's good enough. Thanks for watching. Before I say goodbye, I wanted to shout out the amazingly talented Trauma A.D, whose music you've listened to during this review and right now. All his songs are amazing, so if you like them, go check him out on YouTube, SoundCloud or Bandcamp. Alright, that's all. See ya!